Welcome back, everybody. And we start with the second part of the morning, entitled Teaching Christians About Second Temple Judaism. The conferences of these few days have raised the importance of the topic we are talking about, the recognition that Jesus was Jewish, and that the Gospel are Jewish literature and reflect Jewish traditions. Now we would like to start with an important reflection, maybe in the form of a dialogue between us. How can we bring these issues from our academic conferences and research into the lives of our students? How can we remind our students of the Jewish background of Jesus and the whole Bible? So let's welcome to Professor Sievers, Professor Scott Broder, and Professor Vasile Babota. Also, Professor Daniela Shalabba can't stay here. And I give just a synthetical presentation of the great curriculum of Professor Joseph Sievers. Professor Sievers began his studies at the University of Vienna and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, studying Jewish studies and Hebrew language, and he achieved a PhD in ancient history at the Columbia University in 1981, with a thesis on Hasmonean history. His experience as a teacher is profoundly marked by the topic we will dealing with. So, in fact, in 1975, he was invited to join the graduate program in Jewish Christian Studies at Seton Hall University. And from 1991 until his retirement in 2023, he taught Jewish history and literature of Hellenistic period at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. So Professor Sievers taught hundreds of students from all parts of the world, of the globe, and introduced many of them to the Second Temple Judaism. From 2003 to 2009, he was director of the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University. And since 2008, he serves as consultor for the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. With him, we have Professor Scott Broder and Professor Vasile Babota, and we asked to Professor Broder and Professor Babota to reflect, respond, and develop Joseph Sievers' comments as respondents. I have just a few lines of presentation also for Professor Broder and Professor Babota. Professor Scott Broder is a Jesuit priest from New England in the USA, and he has taught in Gregorian's theology faculty since his years as doctoral student, beginning in 1992. He specializes in the letters of St. Paul and has taught thousands of students from around the world. He is keen to continually point out to them the close relationship between Second Temple Judaism and the beginning of Christianity, as witnessed in the Pauline communities and letters. He loves accompanying students and pilgrims in Rome to the Jewish Museum and neighborhood, in addition to the nearby church built over the place of Paul's house arrest, San Paolo alla Regola, and also to St. Paul's Basilica outside the wall, St. Paul's outside the wall, where is his tomb. Professor Vasile Babota is a layman from Romania, of Ukrainian origins, graduated with a doctorate at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in 2010. He has since taught at the Gregorian University textual criticism, as well as exegetical courses and seminars in the area of the Hebrew Bible. He also specializes in the history of Second Temple Judaism, with a focus on Greco-Roman period, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Flavius Josephus. He is collaborating for the historical and theological lexicon of the Septuaginta. The format of the dialogue will be the like. Professor Sievers will raise particular issues and will speak or reflect about them on the topic. And the respondents will have the opportunity to respond or develop Professor Sievers' considerations. We hope also that participants in the meeting will add their own insights, reflections, and thoughts with respondents one. So let us now give the floor to Professor Joseph Sievers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear students, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me this way? Okay. In my classes on the history of the New Testament period, I sometimes ask students, what is history for you? One Vietnamese student asked back, do you mean official history or underground history? And several African students said that history for them meant what the elders said about past errors in order to help not to repeat them. I leave it to you to decide what type of history I will be talking about. So certainly there have been errors, certainly there's some things that are known officially and some things that may be underground. But anyway, it is quite a challenge to approach the topic of my experience of teaching Second Temple Judaism in the context of a conference on Nostra, Aetate, and the rediscovery of the Jewish Jesus. I've taught in this subject area at the Biblicum for 32 years, and before that in other places in the US and Italy, and also in Israel. One of the first things I learned from my teachers in Austria and in the US was that an important requirement for approaching Jewish literature and history is to study it for its own sake and not as a preparation for the coming of Christ. For me, it was important that I began my academic work in Jewish studies and to complete it with a doctorate in ancient history, not in theology, although I've always had an interest in theology as well. Thus, I began to attend classes for my licentiate in fundamental theology at the Gregorian University at the same time as I started teaching at the Biblicum. So theology was almost an afterthought, although not quite. I was exempted from taking some courses because I taught them myself. While this is a rather unusual course of studies, it seems to me important to come to study Second Temple Judaism on its own terms as much as possible. For my dissertation, I had hoped to find a topic in early Jewish-Christian relations, but that proved impossible with my chosen thesis advisor, Morton Smith of Columbia University. At first, I was a bit disappointed, but then I appreciated very much that the search for new Christian-Jewish relations first required that I acquire knowledge of Judaism, especially in the Second Temple period, for its own sake. I wound up doing a dissertation on Hasmonean or Maccabean history, an area which, until that point, had been studied by non-Jewish scholars, mostly from the point of view of preparation for Christianity. The most important work in that field was at that time, and until at least recently, the famous 4-volume work by Emil Schürer, The History of the Jewish People in the Time of Jesus Christ, the first edition of which was published in German under a different title in 1874. It was republished in English in a completely revised version a century later. It is certainly a very thorough work, but its initial purpose was to show how in the end Christianity superseded Judaism. That aim is absent in the revised version, which is still available. Also the ancient version, at least in English translation, is still available. By concentrating on the 2nd century BCE, I was safely outside the area of Christianity, and I was forced for the time being to forget about Christianity in my research. This provided an opportunity to delve into the books of Maccabees, the writings of Flavius Josephus and other sources, with a view just to understand that period and not necessarily its influence on the birth of Christianity. One result of such research, which I have tried to convey in my teaching, is the incredible variety of positions found in the different sources. And I'll give at least one example of that. Any pretense of knowing what the Jews thought about a particular topic has to yield to a more humble attitude of trying to figure out what views we find represented in our different sources. Parts of the book of Daniel and of various books of Enoch are certainly apocalyptic in nature, but if one looks at what they consider the importance or the role of the temple, there are great differences even among these early Jewish texts. One topic to which I have dedicated much time and energy are the Pharisees, and there are witnesses to that here in this room. The international conference about this topic had the title Jesus and the Pharisees, an interdisciplinary reappraisal. The title was not exactly my choice, but I agree that it was effective and reasonable to choose this title to attract attention. My intention was to try to study the Pharisees in their own right, and that's why after discussing the origin and meaning of the name by Craig Morrison, we went through all the different possible sources before we ever came to Jesus and his relations with the Pharisees, because only if we have an idea who the Pharisees were by themselves can we reasonably discuss their relation to Jesus and Jesus' relation to them. Trying to understand the original meaning is, as Craig Morrison has done, is an important starting point. But that is only the first part of the task. To study, comprehend, and assess the Wirkungsgeschichte is another necessary step. More than 1/3 of the volume, The Pharisees, is devoted to this and to suggestions for the future, among others by Émile Gilles Levine and by Massimo Grilli. The term Wirkungsgeschichte was adapted by or created by Hans-Georg Gadamer in his work on hermeneutics. It is sometimes translated as impact history or history of effects or reception history, in Italian storia degli effetti or storia delle conseguenze, oppure or storia della ricezione, or it is not translated at all. But it is not always understood in the same sense that Gadamer gave it, but is a term that points us to the importance of the effects of how something was and is understood. In the case of the Pharisees, this understanding became filled with prejudice and has had lasting, often devastating effects on the interpretation of the ancient group and on the understanding of Second Temple Judaism or of Jews in general. The term Pharisee or Pharisaical has entered prestigious dictionaries in a variety of modern languages to designate anyone considered hypocritical or legalistic. In the current online edition of Merriam-Webster, the term Pharisaical is defined as marked by hypocritical, censorious self-righteousness. Its definition has no direct connection to the ancient Pharisees. Pharisees have suffered a bad press almost throughout Christian history, and that negativity is still present regularly in homilies and in other forms of teaching. Now, one point is to start from the sources regarding the Pharisees and other topics. The call back to the sources is not a cure-all, but for me it has been at least a good starting point. In the field of biblical studies, the output is so voluminous that it is impossible to keep up with the literature, except perhaps in very narrowly circumscribed areas of research. Yet, it is necessary to look beyond one's own narrow field, if possible, with some competence, caution, and humility. In my studies, encouraged by my teachers, especially Morton Smith, Elias Bickerman, and Louis Feldman, names that ring a bell to some, but not maybe to many of you, I have tried to read sources very closely. One of the early tasks in preparation for writing my dissertation was the compilation of a synopsis of First and Second Maccabees and Josephus's War and Antiquities. That way I had to read every word in the parallel sections of these works and literally cut and paste them together with the other available sources. And I did this much later with the help of 4 students in a seminar at the Biblicum. I was able to produce a printed version of this synopsis. It shows close parallels as well as differences, some of them minor, others major. It also highlights omissions and additions. Synopses of the Gospels or of the books of Kings and Chronicles or Josephus and the books of Maccabees do not prove anything, but they show a great deal and indicate the importance of a close reading of those texts. Time is of course limited, but I found it important to try to give students access to a variety of biblical and more often non-biblical sources that throw light on Second Temple Judaism. The most extraordinary class of material are, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are routinely used for text-critical work on the Hebrew Bible, but the roughly 220 biblical manuscripts constitute only about 1/4 of the extant collection, without counting Dead Sea Scrolls from sites other than Qumran. Many of the other 700 or so manuscripts are frequently cited in works on the New Testament, but often just as proof texts for a particular argument and without proper attention to their context and significance in their own setting. To begin with, there are clearly sectarian documents and others that do not reflect a particular sectarian viewpoint. Many of the writings, however, cannot be confidently attributed to either category. Qumran provides a very narrow keyhole, as some of you know, in the gate to the Knights of Malta on the Aventine Hill, through which one may get an unexpectedly broad view of Second Temple Judaism. For a while in Italy and elsewhere, much attention was focused on a mysterious Greek fragment designated as 7Q5. The idea that this postage stamp size fragment may represent portions of the Gospel of Mark was first floated by our late colleague here, Jose O'Callaghan, but has too many weaknesses to serve as the basis of affirmations about the New Testament at Qumran or the character of the Qumran community. To look for Jesus and the New Testament everywhere is at times counterproductive and hides other more important aspects of those texts, including elements that may be significant not only for the study of Judaism, but also of nascent Christianity. An analogous fate often awaits the works of Flavius Josephus. His work has sometimes been called the fifth gospel in competition with the Holy Land itself. Chaya Cohen, in jest, called Schurer's monumental work and other more recent works paraphrases of Josephus with footnotes. As Steve Mason has argued, using Josephus as a quarry for lifting out pieces of information is not very appropriate and helpful. One has to try to become aware of the context, purpose, and reliability or unreliability of his writings in order to better understand and appreciate them. Josephus has had a very checkered reception history. At times he has been extolled as the most important source for the history of the first century outside the the New Testament, and at other times he has been denigrated as a traitor, especially by Jewish authors, as a mindless compiler of different sources, mostly by theologians, or almost entirely ignored by classicists who left him to the theologians. The part that has elicited the most intense discussion are perhaps two short paragraphs devoted to Jesus in Antiquities 18, the so-called Testimonium Flavianum. In a recent Google search, the term achieved about 39,000 hits. The debate about whether this text is entirely authentic, entirely forged by a Christian author such as Eusebius, or whether there was an authentic text by Josephus that was tampered with by Christian editors or copyists, remains undecided, although a majority of scholars opt for this last possibility. A text of 90 words, or roughly 15 lines out of the 60,000 lines Josephus claims to have composed for the Antiquities. He's one of the few authors who indicates exactly the length of his work. No. Okay. Yes, that has fixed the interest of many Christian readers because it mentions Jesus. To be honest, this text is also one of the primary reasons why Josephus's work were copied and preserved at all, in their entirety practically. Yet, besides the dubious and short information about Jesus, there is much more that Josephus has to offer, without making him a bishop of Jerusalem, as Wisdom claimed in his influential 1737 translation, or a traitorous villain. In recent decades, a more nuanced picture has emerged, where scholars appreciate his literary and historical skills without absolutizing them. Fergus Miller, a famous Oxford historian, suggested that we do not have any account of a war in antiquity that is as detailed and lively as Josephus's war. Therefore, I thought it important to ask students to read extended passages of Josephus's works and not only snippets. Instead of focusing on the often difficult vocabulary and grammar, I usually asked them to read translations, Brill or Loeb, with the text close by. For most of the works in the Brill series, we are lucky to have access to an online version that is richer than the printed one because it also contains the lemmatized text and not only the extensive notes, but also bibliography and images regarding the archaeology of various sites, a list of parallel passages and other features, including text, translation, and commentary of Polybius. All this is now based at the Biblicum. It started out in Toronto, but has now moved to the Biblicum. It's simply PACE at Biblico It project on ancient cultural engagement. While Josephus is the main historical source for the Second Temple period, other sources are important for understanding the social, cultural, and religious situations. Some of these sources are known, at least in part, through the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as various rule documents, commentaries, such as the Pesherim, and books like First Enoch, Jubilees, and Tobit, and in part Ben Sira. Other writings are known only through intermediary translations such as Fourth Ezra, the Psalms of Solomon, and many other writings that were brought together in several collections of the Pseudepigrapha, such as the 2 volumes edited by James Charlesworth in the 1980s. To learn about apocalyptic works other than the biblical books of Daniel and Revelation has, I think, been an important part of the learning experience of many of my students. An early student of mine, Daniel Asefa from Ethiopia, was introduced to First Enoch in such a course and went on to do his doctorate about it at the Sorbonne, becoming an important voice in the field, and he's participating also in Enoch seminars and other meetings these days. If we include the diaspora Jewry, an obligatory step if you want to get insight into the different forms of Judaism at the time, Egypt is the first place to look to, and Philo of Alexandria is the most important author with his large corpus of writings on biblical and other topics, which fills 12 Loeb volumes. I must confess that although I always found his writings of great interest, I never managed to delve into them in my research and only touched some specific questions in my teaching. Egypt is, of course, the richest source of papyri, including many that concern various aspects of Second Temple Judaism, beginning with the Aramaic Elephantine papyri and those in Greek and other languages collected in Corpus Papyrorum Judaicarum of of which the planned 5 of the planned 6 volumes have been published. Papyri and descriptions of which several volumes document different parts of the Roman world often provide an unvarnished, though incomplete, picture of real situations, not only in Egypt, but also such as the Zenon archives of the 3rd century BC, or the archives of Babata and Salome Kumaise of the early 2nd century. Attention to outsider perspectives is helpful as well. Menachem Stern's magisterial 3-volume work, Greek and Latin authors on Jews and Judaism, is the primary place to go to learn what over 160 Greek and Latin authors, from Herodotus to Plutarch and from Tacitus to Simplicius, had to say about Jews and Judaism. In the limited time available in courses on New Testament history, on introduction to or introduction to the New Testament, it was impossible to touch on all these aspects, but these courses sometimes opened windows or doors for students to look at Second Temple Judaism not just through the lens of the New Testament, but from multiple angles. In all this, I found it important to try to approach sources respectfully. We do not have to believe that the numbers of troops in the books of Maccabees or in Josephus were correct, or that their view of things was the correct one, if there was a correct one, but sometimes we can extrapolate what seem to be more reasonable figures. In the past, Second Maccabees was sometimes derided as unreliable and fantastic. A better approach might be to try to understand its background and purpose. Only then can we compare it with a different account of First Maccabees. Now, here I end the first part. In the second part, I would give some very concrete examples of either what I did or what I learned from which books, but maybe my colleagues who have not had this text before them, but only an outline, have some questions, comments, suggestions.
Which one of you would like to start? Maybe Basile? Okay.
Yes, thank you for this first part of your presentation. And in the line of the topic of this presentation, how to bring our knowledge as teachers, scholars to our students, first cycle students, second cycle students. So I would like to focus first on the Septuagint a bit. And my impression is that often the Septuagint is perceived as a mere translation of the Masoretic text, or at the best as an appendix for its so-called deuterocanonical material. But often the issue, like Messianism and other important topics, are overlooked. And I think it's important to tell our students the best use of the Septuagint that is made in the New Testament, for example, that many concepts and many terms that have been used by early Christian authors, also early patristic literature. But I think it's even more important to make them understand that Septuagint is originally a Jewish compilation, a Jewish collection of works in its own right. And also the first revisions of the Septuagint have been done by Jewish scholars. And I think that is one important aspect. And of course you have touched on Maccabees and some other books of the Septuagint, but what comes to my mind now is maybe often overlooked composition, the so-called Psalms of Solomon, for example, which is a collection of psalms from roughly 1st century BCE. Some of the psalms are probably composed in some redaction may be dated a bit later in the early decades of Christian era, but I would like to focus on two aspects. There are many more. First is the aspect of the synagogue. There is a mention of synagogai, Israel, in Psalm 10 and Psalm 17 and 18, I think. We must not take it in technical sense, but at least we have references to the gatherings, to the communities, groups of prayer that gathered in the time of the 1st century CE. And what we can see as we move on from one psalm to another, they are not quite well arranged, but relatively well arranged. We see from the beginning a dependence, attachment to the temple, and as we move on, there is a kind of, so to say, moving back, and the focus is more on these, so to say, groups of prayer. We also have reference to synagogai of Sion, the gathering the synagogues, the groups of the devout ones, for example. A second aspect is about is on the references to Christos to Kyriou. We have this in Psalm 17 and 18. There are 3 or perhaps 4 references. And these come from the late decades of the 1st century BCE. And I think studying them in the light of the many, many references that we have to so-called messianic passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls gives a view of a different community from the Yahad that had its own way of interpreting earlier texts and its own way of so to say, its own relation to the temple and its own way of understanding the coming of Messiah. So in particular, Psalm 17 and 18. And to just add one more thing about the Septuagint, I think it's also important to focus on some specific terms. And one of these terms that comes to my mind, which is also very important for reading New Testament texts, is Evangelion, for example, which has become so important. And probably Paul was the first to have used it in 1 Thessalonians and later on. And so I think, okay, this is just a few thoughts that I have about this. The value of the Septuagint, that it goes far beyond as a translation or its importance for deuterocanonical material. And just one more note on Josephus, for example, is our only source, continuous source that we have from early 2nd century BCE up to sometimes 73, 74 CE, which closes with the discussion of the Temple of Onias in Leontopolis. And I think it provides an excellent background about what had happened during those 2 centuries BCE and the first, for the most part, for the 1st century CE, inside Judea and outside Judea, including some references to diaspora. And maybe one final note on Philo Alexandria, you mentioned him. Most of his commentaries focus on Pentateuch. There is very few comments that go beyond the Pentateuch. So was he a Sadducee? I don't know. But I think that is also important to say that in a context of what we call Hellenistic Judaism in Alexandria, where we think part of Septuagint was compiled, we have a Jew who does not care much, or for reasons that we don't know, does not go much beyond the Pentateuch in his commentaries at least. And that is, I think, something to think about.
I want to look at you, but I need to speak into this.
Yeah, sure.
Joseph, thank you so much. As soon as Maximus and Craig invited me to join, and they mentioned you. I said anything, you know. I want to be there. I want to be part of it. So thank you so much, and also for your faithful witness for all of these years. We're all very moved by that, and you know, thank you so much. I want to begin with this question of sources, and I also have to begin with a little premise. 40 years ago, walking down this corridor is always a very moving experience, because 40 years ago I arrived in this city and began studying Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek in those little classrooms across the way, and in this very room, taking, and thank God, passing those exams. So there's always a little element of stress that I come here, but realizing, and the point of all of this is the great professors before me showed me the importance of the original texts, and that's exactly what you're talking about here, and going back to that original, most especially Josephus. But for all of us, of course, oh, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew? Yeah. It's like, and you need to know it, because you're going to be teaching that, and also knowledge of Greek and so forth. So I got that here. I have to say, too, as I was reflecting on this, obviously, as we just heard, a brief introduction from New England, but from my family name is Brodeur. I was born and raised in a very French-Canadian environment, so my form of Catholicism is that, and I want to share some information about that, because it will affect my way of talking about the Jewishness of Jesus, so there's a method here. But I went to university, to Boston College, and I studied philosophy in French. And I had several brilliant French professors. Little did I know that I ended up writing my dissertation on Jean-Noël Aletti, and there was some kind of continuity there. But I learned explication du texte. We studied Flaubert, we studied Zola, we studied Mauriac, en français dans le texte. And as a young American in the 1970s, it was like this revolution. So understanding, and what you're saying about the sources, and I've tried to bring that on in my own teaching, and I want to say a little premise there. The very first week of class, after like the first cycle of students, that's also something we need to talk about, have a very short time of what are we going to be doing in the coming semester? This is it. So I have to introduce the text, the course to them. And then immediately after that, introduce Paul to them and put him in his context. And I decided early on the best way to do that is to quote Josephus in Jewish Antiquities. Who talks about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes. And is it correct for us to talk about Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, or Judaisms, or schools? There's a great variety here. Let's hear what Josephus says to the Romans about his people and about their belief. And hearing this from a Jesuit Roman Catholic priest, I get their attention. It's wonderful for them to know that. And then for further studies, ladies and gentlemen, there's a room right across the way called the Sala di Lettura, and I invite you to go there. Your tuition money allows you to enter that building, that room, and do more research, to know more about all of this. So giving them the essentials for more, to read more than rather my simple little photocopy from Josephus, the translation is in the Sala di Lettura. So giving them enough, and then inviting them to do more, and to do that in the first century, and so forth. Another problem here, and perhaps we're going to get to that. You, Joseph, have been so blessed to be able to dedicate this in your own studies, and especially, as we call, second cycle and third cycle students. At the present, as we now call it, the Collegium Maximum, we have to focus on first cycle, second cycle, and third cycle, the baccalaureate, the licentiate, and the doctorate, and focus accordingly. Who are the students in front of me? Am I talking to my doctoral students? That's one thing. Am I talking to first cycle students? And obviously, as we're talking an introduction course, you have to get right to the point. There's no time. There's no time to waste. I have 4 hours to say something intelligible about 1 Thessalonians, 4 hours to say something about 1 Corinthians. We move on. It's an introduction course. So I need to get the main points to them and then send them out to do further research. And do so primarily with direct contact with the Greek, And that brings us also in the importance of the Septuagint for them understanding also Hebrew and Greek. So the sources, absolutely. Enough on that.
Okay. Thank you. Now I'll pass.
Maybe someone among participants would like to say something, give insights, reflections about this topic.
Thank you. Are students in the various programs at the Biblicum and the Greg required to take courses in Second Temple Judaism?
Students are required to take history of the New Testament period and an introduction to the New Testament that may sometimes be, for example, Qumran goes under Introduction to the New Testament, and Pharisees go under and Sadducees and others go under History of the New Testament period. But they always have a choice. There are always 2 possible choices. So if they want to avoid these types of courses, they can get an introduction to the New Testament through an introduction to one part of the canon, and by history of the New Testament period, it's more difficult to avoid that, but there are sometimes courses that go more on the Roman context of the New Testament.
Joseph just described the curriculum here in the licentiate in biblical studies. Absolutely true. In the licentiate for theology, it's different. We do not have, unfortunately, the time to do that. And the licentiate here, as we know, is very famous for being relatively long and requiring all of these languages and history. Archaeology, a course in archaeology is required for this licentiate. It is highly recommended in biblical theology, but some of our students do that in addition. So it's one of those in additions. According to the church, the licentiate in theology is a 2-year program. Almost all of our students extend it to 2.5 or 3. And it kind of sets them apart from the others who are doing theology, which is interesting because, of course, we need to do more. Anyway.
Thank you. Very interesting. I have a question about the order of things and how it's done in terms of history. Some people would say, and I would agree, that history could preferably be taught as archaeological, and that's interesting. You mentioned archaeology, because you have to start at the surface, and then you dig your way down, and the questions you ask here are dependent on where you are right now, and then those questions may change as you go through the centuries and down to the period in which you have an interest, the first century, for example. And as you do that, as you start, it seems to me important to understand yourself first. And that, to me, would then necessitate studies of how others see you, because you are formed by in context and by precisely how others see you. And that will then bring some sort of self-awareness, which can also be very important when you then go down the centuries. And that brings me to the question, how is history placed in the overall curriculum where you do these different kinds of studies, for example, inter-religious studies and so on?
Well, yeah, it's part of the curriculum. It's part, usually, of the early part of the curriculum. First come language studies, then come introductory studies, and these are among them. And then come exegetical and theological studies, at least here at the Biblicum. And how this is integrated, well, I've never been a student at the Biblicum, and that's really a big manco. But I think there is some integration, but at times I feel it could be better. How much I have worked together with some professors. For example, we had a colleague who did Latin and Greek and Hellenistic Greek, and sometimes he took texts from Josephus that I would use in my history courses, but there hasn't been, I don't know if there could have been more integration of this. Also, I mean, I felt I have to bring the students outside the area of the New Testament in order to look at it from the outside, so that I insisted on non-integration in some ways. Whether that was right or whether that was one of the errors about which the elders speak, that can be judged by others.
I think what you say, Joseph, is what's your experience of saying to students here, or wherever you are teaching, we look at the sources in and of themselves to just understand this world, you know? I think of Neusner's positive reaction to Afrahat, who he says was the best example of Jewish-Christian dialogue, because first he explains what Judaism is as he understands it before he enters into a criticism, unlike other Ephraim or other who are really anti-Jewish and just show a tremendous ignorance or really stupidity toward Judaism. And that's what you're trying to say to students. First, we want to read these as they are. Have you ever had some reactions from students that were surprised that, well, no, you just took Jesus out of the picture. That's not what we're here for, to learn about this Jewish people. So could you just say a little bit about your experience of announcing that over 30 years?
Well, I must say my experience with students has mostly been very positive. I mentioned an eye-opener for Daniel Asefa, but that was in an area not of the New Testament, but with other students who have found, yes, in order to understand the New Testament well, we have to understand these other texts well. And so I have done some things like I mentioned archaeological visits, or even visits to a synagogue to show how there is a connection, although not total continuity, between this Second Temple period and living Jews today. We don't transplant them into the first century, and we can't transplant the first century into the ghetto of Rome or the Jewish quarter of Rome today, but they are related, and I think that students understood that.
My question is, how do you make students aware that early Christianity is part of Second Temple Judaism? That Second Temple Judaism is not simply a background, but that Christianity should be read within Second Temple Judaism. And the second question is, how much your students are aware that Christianity is part, or they are interested in knowing the Second Temple period simply because it's a sort of setting in which Christianity emerged. I mean, so how do you move from the old idea that Second Temple Judaism was to a certain extent separated from primary Christianity to the new understanding of Christianity being a component of Second Temple Judaism?
Some of my courses have dealt with history before Christianity. Other, I have taught sometimes, maybe not too successfully, the historic courses on the historical Jesus as a Jewish Jesus. I have not emphasized, perhaps not enough, that Christianity is part of Judaism. First, I wanted them to get outside a Christian paradigm. Then they would get a lot about the New Testament and Christianity from all the other professors. So nowadays, maybe I would emphasize more the within Judaism side of Christianity. But since I did not teach Paul, there were other people to do that. I did not teach the Gospels as such. That was other people's task. So, sure, I said that this was the world in which, and to which the early followers of Jesus belonged, and Jesus himself. But I did not go into those texts and say how they are within Judaism, except, sometimes I did, but I never systematically did that.
Just to add that in these university courses are given also about the, let's call, Jewish background of New Testament. And positive element, I think, is that some classes are given by two professors together, one Jewish and one Christian. And this is very useful because we are not only speaking from a Christian perspective of the Jewishness of Jesus or other elements, but from Jewish voices. And this, of course, enriches the kind of offer that we have here.
Maybe we can go to the second part about resources and challenges. Would you like?
Okay. Now, some resources that I found helpful, and I could have mentioned some of the work of people who are present here. I don't, but that doesn't, I mean, the library of the Biblicum is very large, and I pick out just some of the works that I found particularly helpful. But before I go to outside resources, I go to something that maybe some of you do regularly or have done, role-playing. And I found that sometimes as a very good method. I chose situations for which we have different sources and different opinions to address some of the complexities through role-playing. So what happened in Jerusalem at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes? I gave the students 14 different possible roles. And so they could choose, but then, so author of First Enoch, then redactor of Daniel 11, follower of the high priest Jason, the high priest Menelaus, follower of the high priest Onias, scribe or secretary of Antiochus IV, Philip of Phrygia, one of the governors, an observant Jewish woman. I didn't find, I mean, I had mostly male students. I should have found more roles for women, but I didn't want to fixate on the mother of the 7 sons, anyway, that's another question. Member of the Azidai or Hasidim, Eleazar, brother of Judas Maccabee, Jason of Cyrene, the author of the work underlying Second Maccabees, the author of First Maccabees, a non-Jewish citizen of Jaffa, a Samaritan. And then I asked them to answer those questions. Who am I? So they had to read texts that said something about their character. And then, which of the high priests do you like best and why? What is happening in the temple in Jerusalem? What do you think of Judas Maccabee? Is he a liberator sent by God, a bandit, or a dreamer? What does the prohibition of Torah observance mean to you? What do you think of King Antiochus Epiphanes? Who are the heroes for you in this situation? If there are any heroes, what should be done to get out of this situation? And so then I asked students to interact with each other. And sometimes I turned up as wine dealer from Rhodes. Rhodian wine was found, jars were found in the City of David excavations where maybe the Accra was located. So I wanted to find out something about Jerusalem as an ignorant for a Greek. Sometimes students reacted and got into their roles. I always remember one bringing a Hellenic Express card with him to pay for his stay in Jerusalem. So, but that was one way of getting people to study the sources in which they found their roles and to understand the different points of view that were possible. It didn't always work well, but sometimes it worked quite well. So maybe you have other experiences in this sense or suggestions. Now I have a very selective sampling of the literature that I found most helpful. And everyone here would make different choices. But why not? I have nothing to lose. I'm not up for tenure. So I give some names. For an overview of the history, after Schürer, Lester Grabe's 4 volumes on the history of Second Temple Judaism are, I think, a most well-informed collection. Well, one can disagree with him, but this is a work published between 2004 and 2021, now also in paperback and online versions. So that's an entry point. Then I found Shaya Cohen's From the Maccabees to the Mishnah, which is not a continuous history of the period, but it covers different aspects of that history, the temple, liturgy, purity, different groups, and so on, different perspectives. And the latest edition also has a final chapter on early Jewish-Christian relations, which is very concise, but I think very thoughtful and sometimes against the current view of early Jewish-Christian relations. Then I found very helpful the topic of this book and many parts of this book by Tali Lan, integrating women into Second Temple history. I always remember many years ago, I gave an introduction to Second Temple Judaism, and a woman raised her hand at the end and said, "Where were the women?" And I didn't have a good answer. And so that question has remained with me. By now, I know that there are more sources that I have not used, but it always means an effort. Yes, there is the book of Judith, there is the book of Esther. Well, I wrote an article on Hasmonean women and their roles, which was first published in Japanese before it was published in English. But anyway, that was an early effort, but I think it's an important effort, and one has to use all the sources, papyri, inscriptions, as well as, well, the New Testament is also in many places, Luke's Gospel and other places are good to find out about some of the roles of Jewish women. And but Tali Lan put that question in the foreground, and I think I should have done more about that, but I tried some. Then, for a view from the outside, is Menachem Stern's work, Greek and Latin authors on the Jews and Judaism, 3 volumes. That is essential, and I turn to it again and again in teaching, but also in the research. E.P. Sanders has written many important works, but beginning with Paul, but this work, which is still available, it was written, published in 1992, seems old, but it opened doors on a new understanding. One doesn't have to agree with his point of view of common Judaism, but still, it was, has been and remains an important piece. For the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a huge library by now. I still find, although it's now somewhat dated, it was first published in 2002, The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls by James Vanderkam and the late Peter Flint, which gives an overview. Maybe Marcello would have a different view, but I have found this very useful in teaching, and it covers the whole of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then, as a study of the study of Second Temple Judaism or early Judaism, there was a work published in 1986, but covering the years between 1945 and 1980, more or less, different aspects of the study of Judaism. So I think at the beginning of a thesis, one would do well to go through this, as well as, of course, even more, the second edition, same title, different editors, many different contributors. There's now one chapter on gender issues and so on. What is still missing is the Septuagint, which is, unfortunate, but it gives ideas of the different ways of treating, of approaching, entering Second Temple Judaism. Then, as to other resources, I have already mentioned archaeological visits here in Rome. We are privileged this afternoon, Ostia Antica, Jewish catacombs, which are a bit later, but give us a view of Judaism. Not only the one arch of Titus, but the two arches of Titus by now. And then also visits to the ghetto area and to the Jewish Museum and to a synagogue. There are many online resources. I couldn't list them all, but certainly for Dead Sea Scrolls, the Orion Center in Jerusalem is the best, although its bibliography doesn't seem to be working recently. But anyway, then for rabbinic texts that are later, but also for Jewish interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, Sepharia, and then for Josephus and maybe for Polybius and others, there's Pace. Well, I think I'll stop here and give everyone a chance. I would have a few other things to say about challenges, but maybe I'll have one or two sentences at the end about the challenges.
You mentioned the Rhodian vine being used in Accra, Jerusalem, and later there is some evidence. It seems that Herod the Great used like the wine from near Pompeii.
Yeah.
But in Vino Veritas, sometimes we were talking about catching, how to catch the attention of the students. Sometimes if I have an occasion to say, opportunity to say, for example, that the Maccabees came to Rome, that Herod the Great came to Rome, Philo Alexandria came before Paul. Flavius Josephus lived here for quite long, and I think that creates a kind of, as far as I could say, interest to reflect on that students also come to Rome from different countries here, and they think about other ancient people who came here, and I think this environment is quite unique to talk about also non-biblical sources and scholars.
Thank you. Yeah. I did that sometimes.
I remember.
To add on to this, thank you, Joseph, for wonderful information about the bibliography. I want to pick up on what you were saying about role-playing. You did not use this word, but allowed me to. It's an exercise in empathy, isn't it? It's walking in someone else's shoes and understanding how would they imagine their world in a different way. And I think what we're doing here is so important at this moment in history. And about picking up on your verbs at the end of your talk, and we were on the same wavelength, and I'm going to try to show that in so many ways. Talking, learning, and truly listening to one another, and to imagine the other's perspective and where they're coming from. It's as basic as that. And in the present situation, we're all around the refusal of the other. We don't want to encounter the other. We don't want the other to enter our country. And here, trying our best to understand and so forth. And I think that's extremely important. In doing so, as Vasily is just mentioning, here in Rome, in this extraordinary multicultural setting, we are truly in Italy. The language which I've been teaching and trying to teach in all these years is Italiano. And yet, in the midst of it, the ancient languages, never forgetting French, German, English, so forth and so on. This multicultural setting, and then trying to help our students to learn about the ancient world, which was also a multicultural setting. Here in this very city, Paul does not write to the Romans in Latin. And the students are still shocked when I say that. The letter to the Romans is written in Greek. Greek is the language of culture. That's what they spoke. It was several centuries later that the liturgy is turned into Latin. Seminarians are shocked. Yeah, we need to know New Testament Greek. That's where it is. And that's the language which brings us closer to the Hellenized Jews like St. Paul. And picking up Professor Pig, both of you this morning were just extraordinary. Putting Paul in the first century, in the middle of the first century, and not at all in the second century, and putting that in perspective. Romans, go back to the text. And this is touching on also the question of Paul, his communities, connection with Jews, Paul and his communities, and at what point? Very, very quickly, we have no time. The reasons for Romans. Let's walk into the library and pull out 20 different books on why Paul writes the letter to the Romans. He wants to explain his gospel, clearly, the importance of ta evangelion. He wants to travel. Mission. We're in chapter 15, 22 and on. The reasons are, first of all, I want to go to Spain. I want to evangelize Spain. Paul's writing this from Corinth. He's in the middle of the Mediterranean. He's looking at Spain. He has to pass through Italy. But before doing that, I need to go to Jerusalem. What's going on there? The churches, in my Jerusalem ministry, the churches of Macedonia and Achaia, the churches he founded, primarily now Gentile believers, in Philippi, Thessalonica, Athens, Corinth, he's writing from Corinth, the capital of Achaia, have been pleased to share their resources with the poor among the saints of Jerusalem. Already here is Paul's implicit ecclesiology between the Gentile believers and the Jewish believers. And let's listen to Paul talk finances, owing, who is a debtor, who's in credit. They were pleased to do this, primarily these Gentile Christians, and indeed they owe it to them. The Gentiles in Paul's community knew that they owed their salvation to the Jews. There's something that we've forgotten over the centuries. They owe it to them, for if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, thanks to the announcement of the good news, they ought, notice the language, they must, they have to, they ought to also be of service to them in material things. So the Gentiles of the Pauline communities are very much aware of their faith in Jesus coming to them from Jews. And I mean, this is something that we have forgotten in the church today, which needs to be brought up. So the sharing of goods, spiritual goods, material goods, this forms ecclesia. And that comes from kahal. It comes from community. Jews are helping one another, rich and the poor. And Paul's bringing that understanding to his early understanding of how do we form community now that there are all these two major different groups among us who believe in Jesus. Can we dare to eat food together? Wow, what a shock that was for the Jewish Christians, to eat with Gentiles. That was the first crisis of Christianity. And Paul has a solution to that.
Maybe there was a question from the first. Yeah, okay. About the first part of the conference.
It's completely unnecessary because Professor Gargiulo already stated this for the Gregorian University, but I think that complementary to what you already illustrated is important to make room for some teaching hours from Jewish scholars. This is, for my experience, this is crucial, both for the quality of the teaching and also for something which is extra academic, but also important for me. For many of our students, they never seen a Jew or a Jewish scholar. So Jews are something like immaterial, ideal, and not real people whom share also experience, because there is something which is also important, at least for me. It's one of my goals. Together with the academic dialogue, there is the friendship to practice and show friendship in between Jewish and Christian scholar is, to my eye, the first important step to open each kind of dialogue. We can cordially disagree on academic issue, but we show that we are friends.
I think you are running into open doors here. Maybe I can say humbly that I have had little part in bringing Jewish scholars here. Emanuel Tov, Larry Schiffman, Amy Jill Levine. I was not the only one who brought her here, but and then, Adele Reinhardt's not directly, but somehow, yes, that was, tried to open doors, and now the doors are fairly widely open, and also through the Beyer Center. I did some of these things. Actually, Emanuel Tov was invited by the Beyer Center, whose director I was, but he taught here. So it was integration, yes, before the word. So yes, I think it is important, although, I mean, like A.J. Levine has taught New Testament, and her students didn't know sometimes what religion, if any, she was, or whether she was Jewish or not. So sometimes my students think that I'm a rabbi, which I'm. So we cannot fully cross over, but we can try to present the other as much as possible, although never 100%. And so it takes both, I think, that Jewish scholars who deal with different subjects, and by now with any subject that is being taught here, but also Christian scholars who are cognizant of Jewish viewpoints.
Joseph, I would like to tell you on behalf of all international scholars how much we have appreciated your work at the Biblical for all these decades. I mean, I think I had to say this, okay? You know it because I told you several times, but really what you have done here at the Biblical Institute has been very important for all of us, an example for all of us. And I think that at the end of this session, probably I would like to ask you, what are your suggestions for the future of studies because I think that in light of your experience, if you can tell us a word about what you think that we should do now to carry the torch, I mean, for future generations.
Well, I have no institutional role here, and generally I try to refrain from telling other people what they now have to do. But yeah, right. I think that on the one hand, that the fellowship of scholars, Christian and Jewish and others, becomes more integrated. That, I mean, the Enoch seminar is one example. Our Pharisees conference included Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and non-affiliated speakers. And I think that is very important to bring scholars together from different fields and different disciplines. Interdisciplinary work now is very important, and we learned another aspect of this in the past few days by saying, well, even anti-Semitism has to be seen in connection with colonialism, even though it's not the same thing, but the roots may be similar. But we need people from different disciplines to work together and think together. We need, I think, in the education of seminary students and of students of the Biblicum and beyond seminary, people who go into biblical theology and related fields, that they really have an awareness not only of the biblical sources, but also of what lies beyond them. I remember one thesis here, which was a very good thesis, on Ben Sira's autobiographical notes. And I asked something about, well, other autobiographical writings. He said, no, I was working only with the text of Ben Sira. And that seemed to me a rather insufficient answer. And so making people look beyond their own fields, while specialization becomes ever more important, more narrow, but to keep our eyes open beyond that. And then, of course, find ways, how do we bring this to others? In which ways, through which channels, online or social media or publication, book publications, how do we bring that down to other levels, to a broader level of society? But if Nostra Aetate has had a huge impact from one point of view, many people don't know it. Or what does a 1,200-word document of 60 years ago mean to us today? But we have to struggle with that often not knowing or not wanting to know these kinds of things. That is still widespread. But educators had a difficult task in Sumer 3,000 years before the Common Era, and they still have difficult tasks 2,000 years after the Common Era. Yeah.
So, thank you, Professor Sievers, Professor Broder, and Professor Babota. Now we have just a break for the lunch.